This is the third video in a series of 3 videos designed to strengthen your confidence in the Bible. This video focuses on God's promise that He would preserve His word forever. The words of the Lord are pure words, like silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. You shall keep them, O Lord. You shall preserve them from this generation forever. That's Psalm 12, verses 6 and 7. How much do you believe this promise? More specifically, do you believe that God preserved every single word of the Greek New Testament? Or did He just preserve most of them? If you're a genuine follower of Jesus, you undoubtedly believe that God is fully capable of preserving every single word, just as He promised. Knowing that God does not lie, a genuine follower of Jesus must also believe that God cared enough about His word to make sure every single word was preserved. We know that it would be against God's nature to go through the trouble of revealing His words and then not take care to make sure they were preserved, as He promised. The main purpose of this video is to provoke followers of Jesus to fully believe that God has indeed fulfilled His promise to preserve every single word of the Greek New Testament. To fully believe that God has preserved every single word of the Greek New Testament, a genuine follower of Jesus must reject the deistic messaging of the textual critic elites because they do not believe God has preserved every single word of the Greek New Testament. You have 2 choices. You can either approach this subject by faith and choose to believe God's promise to preserve His words, or you can accept the message of the textual critic elites who claim that it is their responsibility to determine the original wording using their deductive reasoning as best they can. Think about it. Why should men have to use deductive reasoning to determine whether certain words belong or do not belong in the New Testament? Do you believe God has preserved every single word of the Greek New Testament? Or do you believe that we cannot know for certain every single word of the original wording of the Greek New Testament? I want Christians to take God at His word and approach this subject by faith. Instead of going along with the multitudes who have bought into the prevailing reasoning of the textual critic elites, I want Christians to examine the facts from a starting point of faith. The textual criticism industry does not start with the assumption that God has preserved every single word of the Greek New Testament. Rather, they begin with the assumption that the exact wording of the Greek New Testament cannot be known for sure. One statement in the preface of the New International Version says, here's their statement, footnotes call attention to places where there is uncertainty about what constitutes the original text. Though many textual critic elites don't talk about it openly, some of them are at least honest enough to admit what they really believe. One of them, Robert M. Grant, said, "It is generally recognized that the original text of the Bible cannot be recovered. To believe such a thing, a person obviously is not starting from a position of faith that God has fulfilled His promise to preserve His words." The entire textual criticism industry began with the deductive reasoning of unbelievers like Brooke Westcott and Fenton Hort back in the 1800s. Hort, the pioneer of textual criticism movement, did not believe that Jesus was God. nor that the Bible was God's words. He also embraced Darwin's theory of evolution. Though it took many decades, the deductive reasoning of deistic thinkers is now being taught as fact in virtually every seminary and Bible college. The most popular English Bibles are translations of the United Bible Society Greek text, which is the result of the textual criticism efforts. The United Bible Society Greek text was put together by textual critic elites who use their deductive reasoning to piece together what they think the authors wrote. These people spend their time debating each other as to which Greek manuscript reading is probably the most accurate for every single verse. They have an endless job because they depend mainly on two manuscripts that happen to be riddled with errors. These two manuscripts, they're called Aleph and B, disagree with each other in almost every verse of the Gospels. Yet, the United Bible Society Greek text depends upon them the most. Stop and think about it. In order for a scholar to purposely depend upon two manuscripts that disagree with each other over 3,000 times just in the Gospels, that person must not be approaching this by faith that God has preserved his words. If God preserved his words, how can these supposedly good manuscripts disagree with each other in almost every verse of the Gospels? If a person really believes that God has preserved every single word of the Greek New Testament, he would agree that these two manuscripts are obviously corrupt, inferior manuscripts. If a scholar starts with the assumption that God has preserved his words, that scholar would turn his attention away from inferior manuscripts and spend his time trying to identify manuscripts that reflect divinely preserved wording. In other words, he would compare all the manuscripts to identify which ones agree with each other perfectly. That's evidence of divine preservation. He would believe that if God preserved his words, there would be manuscripts that show evidence of this divine preservation because of the amazing agreement with the other manuscripts. During the past several decades, several scholars have been comparing thousands of manuscripts, looking for those that agree perfectly. They have discovered that a majority of the Greek manuscripts generally agree with each other throughout the New Testament. In fact, some of the manuscripts agree perfectly with each other, even though they had been kept for centuries in various cities throughout the area of the early church. If you are a genuine follower of Jesus, this information should astound you. Probably even haven't heard of this before, have you? How could such a thing occur, though? Perfect agreement, unless God himself saw to it that his words would be preserved using people. It's supernatural. You might be wondering why the textual critic elites have not discovered this. Apparently, they are so preoccupied with their examination of inferior correct manuscripts that they have never taken the time to consider whether God has indeed supernaturally preserved his words. Instead of approaching this by faith that God has preserved his words, they spend all their time debating with each other about all the disagreeing verses in manuscripts riddled with errors. It brings to mind Romans 1:22. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. This video series is intended to increase your confidence in the Bible. Based upon the things I've said in this video so far, you might be wondering how this could possibly increase your confidence in the Bible. My main purpose for this video is to counteract the deistic messaging of the textual critic elites who claim that we cannot know the original wording of the Greek New Testament. I want more Christians to realize that the overall assumption of these so-called scholars directly contradicts the Bible's claim that God would preserve his words forever. I want more Christians to realize that God has indeed preserved every single word of the Greek New Testament. Anyone who is willing to spend the time to look at the facts will realize that God has supernaturally preserved Greek manuscripts that agree perfectly with each other. If you really believe that the Bible is God's express word to mankind, stop listening to the textual critic elites who are promoting a deistic approach to the subject. Now let me say a few words concerning the popular English Bibles. For the most part, the translation work in these Bibles is fairly good. It's just unfortunate that they used the United Bible Society Greek text as the basis of their translation. Because of this, these translations fail to accurately represent the original Greek wording. But they still convey God's word for all practical purposes in most verses. My grievance is not with the actual text in these Bibles. What I strongly oppose are the notes in the margins of many of them, because it is these notes that are undermining the faith of millions of Christians. Let me provide an example from the ESV. There are so many I could provide. I'll just look at one right now. For example, John 5, verses 3 to 5 in the ESV reads as follows. This is the actual text of their Bible. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. So verse 4 is just completely omitted. Now, here's what their note says. The ESV note says, some, get that word, some manuscripts insert, waiting for the moving of the waters. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring up of the water, stepped in, was made well from whatever disease with which he was afflicted. Now, what should the reader conclude? Is John 5:4 part of the original words or not? Apparently, there's some disagreement among the elite textual critics. The ESV people seem to think it is not a part of the original wording at all. But why do other translations include it? Based upon many notes like this, the logical conclusion is that the original wording cannot be known for sure. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a debate about it. Now, I'm not telling people to throw away their ESV Bibles. I'm merely telling Christians to reject the implication of notes like this one in John 5, verses 3 to 5 in the ESV. There's many I could look at besides these. The ESV translators seem uncertain about the original wording of this passage, but that does not mean that they're correct. Evidence suggests that they are actually greatly mistaken. I'm telling you, the evidence suggests this. Consider this note again. It says in the ESV, some manuscripts insert verse 4. Some. In reality, it is not merely some manuscripts that insert verse 4. 99.2% of all Greek manuscripts do contain these words. 99.2% is far from just some. Virtually, in other words, virtually all the manuscripts contain them, not just some of them. Most popular Bibles contain many such notes. Such notes imply that the words of many verses cannot be known for sure. This directly contradicts God's promise that he would preserve his words forever. These notes like this. In addition, many of these notes are blatantly deceptive, like the one I just cited from John 4, verses 3 to 5 in the ESV. Let's consider just one more. One of the more egregious notes concerning Mark 16, verses 9 to 20. The notes in many popular Bibles read something like this. Some of the oldest manuscripts do not contain verses 9 to 20. That's part of the note. Okay. I'll repeat, some of the oldest manuscripts do not contain verses 9 to 20. Now that's bound to cause the reader to say, well, are those verses supposed to be are they in the original text? That's the natural question that should come to your mind. Notice the word some again. In reality, only 3, not some, of the 1,700 Greek manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark do not contain Mark 16, verses 9 to 20. In addition, many scholars agree that of the 3, one of them is probably a fraudulent rendering of that portion of Mark. So in other words, we can only be confident that there are just really 2 of the 1,700 manuscripts of Mark that do not contain these verses. Therefore, the word some, since it's only 2, is blatantly deceptive, since only 2 of the 1,700 manuscripts omit verses 9 to 20. That note really should say, if they were honest, 2 or 3 of the 1,700 manuscripts of Mark 16, verses 9 to 20, they don't contain these verses. That's what they should say. 2 manuscripts. And it should be noted that these manuscripts that they're referring to, these 2, are riddled with errors throughout them. They're trash. They're terrible witnesses to the original text. It's like if you had a witness in court who were disagreeing with each other at every moment. Those witnesses would be considered rascals, rascally witnesses, and they would be discarded, all of their testimony. That's what should happen. Instead, they rest upon it. Now, the popular Bibles include a second note concerning these verses, which is also blatantly deceptive. It says, a few late manuscripts and versions contain this paragraph. A few. Take note, again, of the word few. In reality, 1,700 manuscripts of Mark contain these verses, not a few, almost all of them, almost every single one of them. Does that seem like a few to you? Since virtually every Greek manuscript of Mark contains these verses, how could any believer assume that they were not a part of the original words that Mark wrote? Since these notes are blatantly deceptive, it is natural to wonder why the textual critic elites would word them the way they did, these notes. Were they just ignorant of the actual facts? Or, worse yet, since the entire textual criticism industry is founded on unproven human assumptions, perhaps they were purposely using deceptive exaggerations in order to persuade multitudes of Christians who do not know the facts to blindly accept their premise as true. Again, see, I want your confidence in the Bible to grow. For this to occur, you must believe that God has preserved his words just as he promised. Therefore, you must reject the implication of certain notes in the popular Bibles because they imply that God has not preserved his words as he promised. You can't have confidence if you accept the false notion that God has failed to preserve his words perfectly. I want you to be assured that he has indeed preserved every single word of the Greek New Testament. The evidence is the abundance of Greek manuscripts that agree with each other, some perfectly. Because these manuscripts are in amazing agreement, we can know, if we believe, that they contain the actual wording of the original Greek New Testament. Because we believe God, we are easily convinced that the amazing agreement is evidence of his supernatural preservation. I hold now in my hand a copy of the majority Greek text that copies the words directly from these manuscripts that agree perfectly with each other. I have every reason to believe that these are the exact words of that the Greek New Testament writers wrote. By the way, just so happens that the words in this Greek New Testament are very similar to the Textus Receptus, which was used a few hundred years ago when they translated the KJV and a few other translations. Now, in this series of videos, I have shown that the Bible claims to be God's exclusive word to mankind. I have alerted you to the fact that God has indeed preserved every single word of the Greek New Testament. So I challenge you again, do you believe that the Bible is God's exclusive word to mankind? Do you believe that he cared enough to preserve every single word as he promised? If you do, well, you're blessed of God. Your faith is not being undermined. May God give his people strong faith to believe these things as we face the trials that are coming ahead. God bless. Thanks for watching. By the way, if you have any questions, you want to discuss this further, I have lots more I could say and talk about, information I could show you. You can email me directly at stonescryout, one word, at AOL.com. Thanks for watching.